was glad. That's about how I feel.
Scientists waited 47 years to open what they believe is Elvis Presley's true coffin, locked away from the world since his burial. But when it finally opened, something unexpected crawled out, leaving experts shouting in fear and disbelief. What could survive inside a coffin for so long? What did they really discover there? Join us as we find out. The breathing grave. Thomas Morrison had always been a gentle soul, the kind of man who spoke softly to the birds that nested in the cemetery trees and remembered the birthday of every groundskeeper who worked under his care. At 63 years old, with silver hair that caught the morning light and eyes that crinkled warmly when he smiled, Thomas had dedicated 41 years of his life to maintaining the sacred grounds of Graceland's meditation garden. He treated every grave with tenderness, every memorial with reverence, as though the departed were old friends simply resting after a long journey. His wife Martha often said he had the kindest hands she had ever known, hands that planted flowers with patience and swept walkways with care. Thomas never raised his voice, never hurried through his duties, and never once considered that the peaceful sanctuary he tended would one day become the center of something impossible. But on this particular October evening, as amber sunlight filtered through the ancient oak trees casting long shadows across the manicured lawn, Thomas felt something he had never experienced in all his decades of service. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, the birds had gone silent, and the ground beneath his feet trembled with a rhythm that felt disturbingly alive. It started so subtly that Thomas almost convinced himself he had imagined it, a barely perceptible vibration beneath the soles of his worn work boots as he approached the most visited grave in the garden. The white lilies he had carefully arranged that morning now quivered as though touched by an invisible hand, their petals shivering despite the absence of wind. Thomas knelt down, his weathered knees protesting slightly, and pressed his palm flat against the cool grass. What he felt made his heart stutter with confusion and fear. But then he saw the bronze memorial plaque begin to shift ever so slightly, tilting upward by just a fraction of an inch before settling back down. The flowers surrounding the grave trembled again, more noticeably this time, and that rhythmic pulse continued, steady and patient, like something waiting to be noticed. Thomas stood on unsteady legs and reached for his radio with trembling fingers. His voice cracked as he spoke into the device, trying to maintain the calm professionalism he had practiced for 4 decades, but failing entirely. Within minutes, other groundskeepers arrived, their faces initially skeptical until they too placed their hands against the earth and felt what Thomas felt. Fear spread through the small group like wildfire. Nobody spoke the obvious question aloud, but it hung heavy in the evening air between them. How could ground that had been undisturbed since 1977 suddenly begin moving, as though something beneath it had awakened? The emergency calls went up the chain of command faster than anyone expected. Within 2 hours, as darkness fully claimed the cemetery and floodlights were hastily erected, 3 black vehicles with government plates pulled through the memorial garden gates. The men who emerged wore suits too expensive for ordinary officials and carried themselves with the rigid purpose of people accustomed to keeping secrets. They spoke in low voices to one another, their faces grave and tense, and they brought with them equipment that seemed far too sophisticated for a simple cemetery investigation. Dr. Helena Voss stepped out of the lead vehicle, a woman of 58 with sharp features and gray eyes that missed nothing. She had built her career in the shadows, leading a scientific division that most government officials denied existed. For 17 years, her team had been monitoring something they could not explain, an energy signature emanating from beneath the meditation garden that defied every known law of physics. The readings had always been there, faint but persistent, like a heartbeat measured across impossible distance. But 3 weeks ago, those readings had changed. They had grown stronger, more regular, more insistent. Helena had hoped she would never have to come here, never have to face the possibility that their monitoring might need to become intervention. But the data left no room for denial anymore. Something inside that grave was generating heat, electromagnetic fluctuations, and patterns of energy that suggested consciousness. Something that should have been nothing but memory and bone was instead very much alive. She approached Thomas, who stood apart from his fellow groundskeepers looking pale and shaken. Her voice when she spoke to him carried unexpected gentleness. "I need you to tell me exactly what you felt. Every detail matters now." Thomas described the breathing earth, the moving plaque, the trembling flowers. Helena listened with the intensity of someone who already believed him, who had perhaps been expecting this moment. When he finished, she simply nodded and turned to her team. "Begin the preliminary scans. I want thermal imaging, seismic readings, and electromagnetic mapping before midnight. And someone contact the others. Tell them the 37th protocol is now active." They arrived just before midnight. 7 elderly men whose faces bore the weight of decades spent carrying impossible secrets. The youngest was 74, the oldest approaching 90, and each one moved with the careful slowness of bodies that had lived too long, with the burden of knowing what most of the world did not. They wore suits that had gone out of fashion years ago and gathered in a tight cluster near the grave, their expressions mixing fear with something that looked heartbreakingly like relief. James Whitfield had been only 29 years old when he stood in this exact spot on a sweltering August night in 1977. Watching something unfold that his mind still struggled to process nearly 5 decades later. He had been a junior medical examiner then, called in to assist with what should have been a routine verification. But nothing about that night had been routine. He remembered the way the air had crackled with energy, the way instruments had malfunctioned, the way every person present had felt the presence of something that defied explanation. They had all been sworn to silence, bound by legal documents and moral pressure, told that speaking about what they had witnessed would destroy everything the public believed and needed to believe. Now James stood before that same grave with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "We should have spoken years ago," he whispered to his companions. "We should have told someone what we saw, what we did." Another of the old men, Richard Chen, placed a shaking hand on James's shoulder. Richard had been a security specialist that night, responsible for ensuring that the burial proceeded without interruption or observation. He remembered the specialized equipment they had installed, the layers upon layers of reinforcement, the way everyone had moved with barely contained panic. "We took an oath," Richard said quietly, though his voice carried no conviction. "We were protecting people from something they could not understand." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they rang hollow. They had not been protecting anyone. They had been hiding something, sealing away a truth that now seemed determined to emerge regardless of their attempts to bury it. As midnight approached and Dr. Voss's team completed their preliminary scans, the results confirmed what everyone present had begun to fear and suspect. The grave contained layers of construction that went far beyond normal burial practices. Beneath the earth lay steel reinforcement 3 inches thick. Beneath that, a secondary chamber lined with materials designed to absorb electromagnetic radiation. Beneath that, chain link barriers that served no decorative purpose but formed what engineers would recognize as a Faraday cage. And at the center of it all, the coffin itself, sealed with mechanisms that required specific tools and specific knowledge to open. This was not a resting place. This was a containment facility, a prison built to look like a grave, a cage constructed with the careful planning of people who feared what they were burying. Helena studied the readouts on her tablet, her expression growing more troubled with each passing moment. The energy signatures were strongest directly above the coffin, pulsing with a rhythm that matched human respiration almost exactly. The thermal imaging showed a heat source inside that registered several degrees above ambient temperature, and the electromagnetic patterns suggested neural activity, the firing of synapses, the presence of a mind that was aware and thinking and waiting. Thomas watched from a distance, his gentle heart breaking as he realized that the sacred ground he had tended with such love for so many years had never been what he believed it was. The memorial he had honored, the flowers he had planted, the reverence he had shown, all of it had been built atop a lie. Something had been sealed beneath this beautiful garden, something that men in power had decided the world should never know about. And now, after decades of silence and containment, that something was waking up. The moment the cage opened. Dr. Sarah Chen had spent her entire life searching for the impossible. At 42 years old, with warm brown eyes that sparkled with curiosity and a smile that put even the most nervous patients at ease, she had dedicated 20 years to studying the mysteries of human consciousness and the thin line between life and death. Her colleagues adored her gentle nature, the way she spoke to laboratory subjects with tenderness, how she never lost her sense of wonder even after countless failed experiments. The specialized equipment hummed loudly in the cold October air as Dr. Voss's team worked through the layers of steel and concrete. Each lock that broke sent vibrations through the ground that everyone could feel in their bones. Sarah watched with growing unease as the engineers used tools that seemed designed specifically for this moment, as though someone decades ago had planned not only the sealing, but also the eventual opening. The elderly men who had carried their secret for so many years stood in a tight cluster, their faces pale and frightened. Thomas the groundskeeper had moved closer despite his fear, unable to look away from the scene unfolding before him. "Final layer approaching," one of the engineers called out, his voice tight with tension. The coffin itself would be next. Sarah felt her heart racing as Dr. Voss gave the command to proceed. The air temperature had dropped noticeably, their breath now visible in small clouds. Instruments monitoring electromagnetic fields began beeping erratically, needles swinging wildly across displays. Something inside was reacting to the opening, responding to the first touch of outside air in 47 years. The coffin lid, reinforced with metals Sarah did not recognize, began to rise with agonizing slowness. Hydraulic lifts groaned under the weight. Every scientist present took an unconscious step backward. The darkness inside seemed deeper than it should be, almost solid, as though light itself was reluctant to enter. Sarah found herself holding her breath, her knuckles white, as she gripped her tablet. "Thermal signatures are increasing rapidly," she reported, her voice barely steady. "Whatever is inside is generating heat." Then came the sound that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. It started as a low vibration, felt more than heard, that seemed to emanate from the coffin itself. Then it rose into something that might have been a breath if breaths could carry such desperate hunger. The sound climbed higher, becoming almost a cry, but wrong somehow, distorted and ancient, and filled with an emotion that might have been rage, or might have been pleading, or might have been both twisted together. It was not human. It could not be human. Yet, it carried an intelligence that was unmistakable, a consciousness that was aware and suffering and angry at its long imprisonment. "Everyone back!" Dr. Voss commanded, but nobody moved. They were frozen, caught between terror and scientific fascination. The sound faded slowly, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and expectant. James Whitfield, the old medical examiner who had been present at the original burial, began to weep openly. "It was awake even then," he whispered. "We knew it was awake, and we sealed it anyway." When the lid finally rose completely and lights were directed inside, Sarah felt her legs go weak. Her scientific mind struggled to process what her eyes were showing her. She had expected remains, perhaps preserved unusually well, but still unmistakably dead. What lay before them defied every law of biology she had ever studied. The body inside was neither alive nor dead, but trapped in some horrifying state between. The skin held a gray pallor that suggested decades without blood flow, yet it retained an elasticity that death should have stolen long ago. The chest did not rise and fall with breath, yet machines immediately began detecting something that should not be possible. Cellular activity, faint but undeniable electrical impulses firing through neural pathways. And most impossibly, a pulse. "This cannot be real," Sarah breathed, moving closer despite her fear. Her instruments confirmed what her eyes refused to believe. Deep within the chest cavity, the heart was attempting to beat, not regularly, not successfully, but trying. A muscle that should have decayed to nothing was instead contracting with painful slowness, as though some force was feeding it energy, keeping it functioning at the absolute minimum level necessary to prevent true death. "What have we found?" one of the younger scientists asked, his voice breaking. Sarah did not have an answer. This was not suspended animation as science understood it. This was not cryogenic preservation. This was something else entirely. Something that suggested the body had been conscious through decades of darkness and isolation, aware but unable to move or speak or escape, sustained by some energy source that her equipment could detect but not identify. Dr. Voss knelt beside the coffin with shaking hands, running scanners over the body that responded with readings that made no sense. "Cells are showing signs of regeneration," she reported, her clinical voice failing to mask her shock. "There is neural activity in the brain, not dormant, active, thinking." She looked up at her team with eyes wide with realization. This consciousness has been trapped and aware for 47 years, sustained by something we do not understand, fighting every single moment to remain in existence. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she understood the true horror of what had been done. This was not a burial. This had been a living imprisonment, a conscious being sealed away from the world and left to survive in darkness through sheer will and some force that defied explanation. The energy signatures they had been monitoring for years were not residual readings. They were the desperate struggle of something that refused to die, that fought every moment against the end, that waited with terrible patience for the chance to return. "What do we do now?" Thomas asked softly from behind her. Sarah looked into the coffin, at the face that held an expression of such profound suffering and rage, and whispered the only truth she knew. "We pray we can help it, because if we cannot, I fear what it will become." When the legend finally looked back, Rebecca Martinez had always been the kind of person who noticed what others missed. At 37 years old, with gentle hands that had once played piano for hospice patients and a voice that could calm even the most frightened children, she had left music therapy to pursue neuroscience because she wanted to understand the human mind at its deepest level. Standing beside Dr. Chen near the opened coffin, watching instruments flash with impossible readings, Rebecca felt that familiar metal against her skin and whispered a prayer. She had no idea that within moments, she would experience something that would change not just her understanding of science, but her understanding of reality itself. The eyelids moved first, just a flutter, so slight that Rebecca almost convinced herself she had imagined it. Then they twitched again, more deliberately, as though whatever lay beneath was remembering how to control muscles that had not moved in decades. The scientist stood frozen as those eyes slowly opened, revealing something that made Rebecca's breath catch in her throat. The gaze that met theirs was wrong. These were not the warm, charismatic eyes the world remembered from photographs and films. They were empty, yet somehow burning with terrible awareness. Peaceful, yet radiating danger. Confused, yet calculating. The pupils dilated and contracted rapidly, as though adjusting to light after an eternity of darkness. But more disturbing was the intelligence behind them, a consciousness that seemed both ancient and freshly awakened, familiar yet completely alien. "Is it aware of us?" Dr. Voss whispered, her clinical composure finally cracking. Rebecca moved closer, drawn by professional curiosity and human compassion, despite her fear. The moment she locked eyes with the figure in the coffin, her world exploded into images that were not her own. Rebecca gasped as her mind filled with scenes she had never witnessed. A desert at midnight under stars that seemed too bright and too numerous. A crossroads where the air shimmered with heat that had nothing to do with temperature. Two figures standing face to face. One human and desperate, the other something else entirely wearing a shape that hurt to perceive. Words spoken in a language Rebecca did not know, yet somehow understood. A contract offered, a price named, a signature given in blood that burned as it touched paper, covered in symbols that predated human writing. "Do you see it too?" Dr. Chen gasped beside her, her face pale and sweating. Around them, every scientist who had looked into those eyes staggered backward, clutching their heads, experiencing the same impossible visions. The deal, the bargain, the exchange of talent and fame and adoration for something that was never meant to be given. Success that was not earned through ordinary means, but purchased from forces that existed beyond human understanding. Thomas the groundskeeper fell to his knees, weeping. What did he do? What did he agree to? While the team struggled with their shared visions, Dr. Voss recovered enough to examine the coffin's interior more carefully. Her hands found a sealed compartment built into the lining, hidden beneath layers of fabric and metal. Inside lay papers that should not have survived decades of burial, documents preserved with the same impossible care as the body itself. Rebecca forced herself to focus through her spinning mind and read over Voss's shoulder. Contracts written in legal language mixed with symbols she recognized from her visions. Witness signatures from people whose names carried weight in industries that controlled entertainment and power. Dates that aligned with moments of unprecedented success. And at the bottom, a clause written in ink that seemed to shift and move on the page. Payment due upon natural conclusion. Failure to deliver shall result in collection by alternative means. The agreed cannot escape. The bargain is eternal. He made a deal for fame, Rebecca whispered, horror dawning. But he never paid what was owed. They sealed him here not to honor him, but to prevent collection. The being in the coffin drew what might have been breath. The air temperature plummeted so rapidly that frost formed on metal surfaces. Birds that had been singing in distant trees fell silent. Streetlights surrounding the cemetery flickered and passed away. Electronic equipment sparked and failed. The earth itself seemed to shudder with unease. Rebecca watched as the figure's chest began rising and falling with more strength, as color slowly returned to gray skin, as fingers twitched with growing control. This was not a man waking from sleep. This was something that had been trapped between worlds, prevented from dying, yet unable to truly live, sustained by forces that demanded their payment. Something that had spent 47 years in conscious darkness, aware of every passing moment, feeling the weight of an unpaid debt growing heavier. "What have we done?" Sarah Chen breathed, backing away. The eyes tracked her movement with terrible focus. Behind that gaze was not the gentle entertainer the world mourned. Behind those eyes was something that had been changed by decades of imprisonment and the presence of whatever force had kept it alive. Something ancient had regained awareness, fed by rage, and sustained by bargains humanity was never meant to make. The temperature dropped further, the ground trembled, and Rebecca understood with chilling certainty that they had not simply opened a grave. They had broken a seal that was meant to hold forever. Something was awake now, something was free, and the debt it carried would soon demand to be paid in full. The choice between mercy and safety. Dr. Emma Walsh had never been able to walk away from suffering. At 51 years old, with silver streaks in her dark hair and eyes that held both wisdom and sorrow, she had spent 3 decades working with patients everyone else had given up on. She stayed late at bedsides, held hands through final moments, and believed with her whole heart that every soul deserved compassion regardless of what they had done or become. Her daughter often said she cared too much, loved too deeply, fought too hard for people who could not fight for themselves. Tonight, standing in the cold cemetery air watching something impossible struggle back toward life, Emma pressed her palm against her chest and felt her own heart breaking. She understood that within the next hour, she would help make a decision that would haunt her until her dying day. A choice between mercy and safety, between compassion and protection, between allowing something to live or condemning it to an eternity of conscious imprisonment. The emergency meeting happened right in there in the meditation garden, with dawn approaching and the coffin still open before them. Government officials who had arrived in the night stood beside scientists whose worldviews had shattered completely. The being inside had grown stronger with each passing hour, its chest now rising and falling regularly, its eyes tracking movement with frightening awareness, its presence radiating energy that made every instrument scream warnings. "We cannot let it return fully," Dr. Voss stated firmly, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "The documents show clearly what this entity became through its bargain. The force sustaining it is not natural. We have no idea what it might do if released completely into the world." Emma stepped forward, her gentle voice trembling, but determined. "But we also cannot condemn a consciousness to eternal imprisonment. Can you imagine what 47 years of awareness in darkness has already done? How can we sentence it to continue existing in that state?" Thomas, the groundskeeper, who had maintained this sacred space with love for decades, spoke quietly from where he stood. "Maybe some things are sealed away for good reason. Maybe our ancestors understood something we are only now discovering." Before anyone could respond, the being in the coffin moved. Not violently, not threateningly, but with deliberate purpose. Its hand lifted slowly, fingers extending toward Emma, who stood closest. She felt her colleagues grab her arms to pull her back, but she remained still, watching as energy began flowing from the figure in visible waves that made the air shimmer like heat rising from summer pavement. The communication came not through language, but through pure emotion and memory projected directly into every mind present. Emma gasped as she experienced what the being wanted them to understand: the desperate hunger for fame that had driven a young man to a desert crossroads decades ago, the intoxicating rush of success that had seemed worth any price, the gradual realization as years passed that the bargain had cost more than talent and life, that it had begun changing something fundamental in his soul, the growing horror as he understood what he had become and what would be demanded when his natural life ended. "It tried to escape the contract," Rebecca whispered, tears streaming down her face as she processed the shared vision. "That is why it was sealed, not to honor him, but because dying naturally would have triggered the collection. They trapped him between life and death to prevent whatever force he bargained with from claiming what was owed." The emotion flooding from the coffin intensified, regret so profound it felt like drowning, sorrow for choices made in youth and desperation, fear of what existed on the other side of true death, and beneath it all, a terrible, exhausted plea, not for freedom, for mercy, for an end to awareness, for the prison to become permanent and complete so that consciousness could finally cease and the debt could remain forever unpaid. The decision was made as the sun rose over the cemetery, casting golden light across a scene of impossible tragedy. Emma stood with tears on her cheeks as she added her agreement to the terrible choice. They would not allow it to return fully to life, but they would also not leave it in the half-aware state it had endured for so long. They would seal it deeper, colder, in a place where consciousness itself might finally cease. The construction took 3 days. A chamber built far beneath the meditation garden, reinforced with materials designed to absorb not just physical presence, but energy itself. Metals that dampened electromagnetic fields. Concrete infused with compounds that created a void where even thought might struggle to exist. They moved the coffin with reverence and sorrow, Emma whispering apologies the entire time. As they prepared the final sealing, Emma placed her hand one last time on the coffin's surface. "I hope you find peace," she whispered. "I hope wherever your consciousness goes in that darkness, it finds a way to sleep at last." The being inside did not respond, but she felt a final pulse of energy that might have been gratitude or might have been resignation. Official statements claimed structural concerns required temporary relocation and reinforcement of the memorial site. The world accepted the lie easily, eager to return to comfortable beliefs about legends and legacies. The meditation garden was restored beautifully, flowers planted with care by Thomas, who worked with hands that shook. But deep beneath that peaceful surface, in a chamber designed to last millennia, something remained trapped in its impossible state. The scientists who knew the truth carried their knowledge like stones in their hearts. Emma retired quietly within the year, unable to continue her work after participating in such a terrible mercy. Years would pass, decades perhaps. The world would spin and change and forget. But in that cold darkness far below, protected by layers of steel and stone and silence, something waited. Not dead, not alive, sustained by forces beyond human understanding, and trapped by choices made in desperate youth. The question nobody dared voice aloud haunted them all. If 47 years of imprisonment had not stopped its struggle to exist, how long before that terrible will found a way to try again?